Can Washington land a two-way star?
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And this episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKDOWNCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Lars, we got a really fun show coming at all the everydayers today. We're going to talk about some possible late additions to Washington's official visitor list for this Friday, May 30th, when there's supposed to be a very, very long list of talented players coming in for their visits. We're going to talk about how many open spots there might be in the secondary in this 26 class, with 3 commits already in the boat. And another very interesting one who was supposed to visit in early May, decided to reschedule his visit, now is going to be coming in on May 28th, this Wednesday. That's 4-star safety, wide receiver, whatever you want to call him, in Salesi Moa. And Lars, you and I were kind of sitting here talking about what this visit was going to look like, and we had a very simple question, because after he took his official visit to Michigan State, he told, I believe it was 247 Sports' Blair Angulo, that the Spartans will look at him to play 2 ways. Could he do that here at Washington?
Absolutely. I think when you, first of all, peel back the curtain, where no matter where he goes, you probably can. But I think at Washington, it's a perfect situation where you're looking at that receiver room thinking you need to add a big body receiver, maybe 2 at the position, but maybe like 1.5. So how do you get a half? Well, take a guy that you absolutely know you'd want to start at safety on defense and say, hey, you know what? You got that 6'2 frame, 195, 185, somewhere in that ballpark. But the production is also there. Receiver, 800 yards, 10-plus touchdowns in back-to-back seasons as a sophomore, junior year. Probably going to be able to have another similar season like that this coming fall. And so to me, when you think about what Jedd Fisch, Jedd Fisch loves to get creative. And I think there's absolutely a world in which Salesi Moa could, I'm not saying be like, wide receiver 1, but 2, 3, potentially 4, like absolutely down the line.
So I believe it was one of our awesome everydayers, Dusty, who asked this question the other day, where it's, hey, is there ever going to be a place where there's no spot open for Salesi Moa? And I replied, and I was like, no, there's always a spot for a player like Salesi Moa. And this is one of the really interesting things about it, because we look at where Washington might sit from him for just, in terms of where his favorites are right now. And you and I both believe they're on the outside looking in. And I looked at this whole process, and I was just going through, some of these other top schools, and I said, Washington is certainly in the mold of trying to figure out how to make this 2-way player thing work. Because you talked to 4-star wide receiver Chris Lawson about that last year, saying, maybe they're going to try him out at DB at some point down the line after he figures out the whole receiver thing. And it was something that Giles Jackson spoke about with the media last fall. We were sitting in a press conference with him, and we asked him, hey, who's one guy that stands out right now? And he just instantly was like, Rashawn Clark. And it wasn't even just, the fact that we saw him turn into a really awesome defensive back this spring after redshirting last season. It was, he's been running scout team offense with us, and he looks like somebody who you could put the ball in his hands if you really wanted to. And I think that's where I'm really intrigued to see what happens here, because I talked about it on Friday's show, where this is a really high risk strategy when it comes to recruiting wide receivers. When, of your top 4 targets, let's call them, 3 of them are committed elsewhere right now. And one of them is from way outside your footprint and 4-star wide receiver Mason James. So you really could sell Salesi Moa as, hey, not only would you end up being the number 1 defensive back we're taking this year, but you're also the number 1 wide receiver. I feel like that's something that really could resonate for Washington as they try to make a push for him.
I agree. Or the other name also, Dylan Robinson, when Jedd Fisch straight up just talked about during the Sunday press conference where Kevin Cummings and John Richardson are still fighting over him. And Jedd's kind of, leaning back with the water going, I don't know, Matt. I think we're thinking Matt wants to be a receiver too. And it's that type of mindset that Jedd has, where it's not we're going to throw the kitchen sink to figure out, hey, we're going to say and do everything. I think there also is a legitimate vision and path to where Jedd could say, here's how I'm going to use you. Not just, hey, you want to, whatever it takes to get you to come to Washington, we'll do it. It's no, we want you, but also let's there's actually a plan behind it. And when you talk about the other guys in the room, there's only one that's over 6'2" or 6'1". And when you're looking at those top 4 guys in the class, and that's Madden Williams and St. John Bosco, both Vance Baffert and Mason James are under 6 foot. if you throw Daniel Odom in that mix as well, okay, that's another guy, but it's really only two. And so to me, if you don't get any of that combination of guys, really Madden or Odom, obviously Salesi then kind of becomes like he could actually even see himself, oh, I am the only big body guy. You took two smaller guys, that type of thing. But either way, I think you have the legitimate vision. I just want to make it clear that it's not just like, hey, because there is a part of that, but I don't think that's the solely thing that it's based off of, because we've seen it with a number of guys that Jedd has suggested can play both ways.
So I certainly agree with you there, where I just kind of thought about this from a different perspective, where of course you want to make sure that you find a way to secure some of those guys where, if you don't get Daniel Odom or, Matt Williams or whatever, that this is just another nice way to go. But I think it's a little different than that, where he is the ultimate, one of Jedd Fisch's very first things that he said when he got here to Washington was, we are not in a position to turn down talent. That's exactly what this is, where it's, if there's any point where Salesi Moa says, I'm comfortable, I want to commit to Washington, it's, we're going to take you now and we're going to figure the rest out later. Because we're seeing more and more of that, not even just from a perspective of a two-way player. I like that you brought up Dylan Robinson in that light as well. But that was one of the things we saw when Donovan Robinson committed, where, him and Jonathan Epperson were both listed as safety linebacker. And now we've seen them flip-flop, where Epperson was listed as that athlete. I think you and I both expected maybe he'll end up at safety. Now he's playing linebacker full-time, and Donovan Robinson has transitioned to safety, more or less. We'll see what that looks like when he gets here in June. But that's one of those things where you just take the talent, you get him on campus, and then you say, we're going to figure out where you work best in our defense once you get here. And it could be the exact same thing with Salesi Moa, because he has enough talent to be an early impact player at safety. He also has enough talent to be an early impact player at wide receiver. And if you come in here and you try him out at both spots and you say, you can't keep this guy off the field at either spot, great, you go from there. And I feel like that's one of the things that just Jedd has done a really good job of since he got here, is just figuring the rest out later sort of thing, where I feel like there have been too many times where you and I, from covering this, players will kind of get pigeonholed into a certain spot, and it maybe will turn them off from one school or another because they say, no, I feel like I can do this, this, and that. And that's just not been what this coaching staff, recruiting staff has been about at all.
Absolutely. I mean, when the name that came to mind was Austin Joyner when he committed to Wazoo one time because he was going to play running back or something like that. And it's like, okay, there's certain things in, Bob Militalo, another guy where he goes from D-line to O-line. There's always changes that go about it in recruitment. But the name, honestly, that I was thinking about most, and it predates Jedd, but it has actually a Jedd Fisch tie, and that's Shaq Thompson when he played running back and was also still on defense as well. And it's just, you're talking about maximizing the skill set when you talk, you're going after premium talent. If that premium talent can help you on both sides of the ball, you're not expecting him to, have, 1,100 yards, 12 touchdowns plus, 120 tackles on defense. Like, that's just not. But now, again, does that potential exist in Salesi Moa? There's a non-zero chance, but, that's why you're going to do that. You don't do that with any target. You don't look at, I'm not going to throw names out there. You look at the receiver board that they're targeting. They're not also looking at the DB board saying, hey, any of you guys play receiver at your school, you can go also play offense. There's a specific type of player that we're looking in. Obviously, Salesi Moa checks all those boxes.
Absolutely. And that's one of the real interesting things about where this class could go, because it just poses the question, how many open spots does Washington have in the secondary right now? And we'll get to that right after a message from our friends over at Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. Your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. Now I budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Managing money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKDOWNCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKDOWNCollege for half off your first year. So, Lars, we look at this secondary right now in 2026. You've got 3 players committed. That's cornerback Elijah Durr, cornerback Kasani Giles, and safety CJ Lavender. And you and I just kind of looked at this, and we look at who's coming in on a visit. And I have a feeling that Washington wants to take 6 defensive backs this year, which feels like a lot for a class. But, when you've got 5 on the field at all times, you can certainly find a way to make that work because there are so many guys coming in, not just on this May 30th weekend, but moving forward as well.
There was a class a couple of years ago that they loaded up in the secondary as well. So kind of every 2, 3, 4 years, it just seems like there's a big class of DBs that comes to Washington. I can't remember off the top of my head what class it was, but it was relatively recently. And I think the numbers kind of track it out where you're looking and thinking you're losing your top 2 guys. You're actually losing your top 3 or 4 when you talk about McAllister, potentially Dyson McCutcheon if he, does the Elijah Jackson route, depending on how long he has left. And so you look at from a long-term depth and impact standpoint, you need to reload that in the secondary just across the board. And one thing we've seen with this class is there's a lot of position versatility, but the guys remaining, you're looking at and thinking, for the most part, where you're going to see him, like Derrick Johnson, if they happen to take him, or Derrick Johnson the second, technically, where he would, because obviously Derrick Johnson already did play at UW, back in the day. With that being said, he's going to be an outside cornerback, but for the most part, that the fact that there is so much position versatility, that number could be 5 or 6, and kind of to tie it in with Celeste. Like if you happen to get a player like him, that you're only really counting that as one spot depending on where you put him. But either way, I like where the class is positioned, but you're looking still to kind of just close it out with the remaining guys that you're looking at.
So I'm glad you started with Derrick Johnson the second, because that's where I feel like this conversation starts. Because he's somebody who originally didn't include Washington in his top 6 after they were a late offer. He's able to circle back around and give him an official visit over this big weekend where, it's very obvious that this is a list of priority targets where you look just up and down where it's, Derek Coleman-Brusso was on this visit list, and then of course he ends up committing, but it's Vance Spafford, who we know is at the top of their wide receiver board. We just look all the way up and down with guys like Dominic Harris, and it's just, there are priority targets all over the board. And I think that's one thing where I look at Derrick Johnson and it's, this would be a really nice addition to this secondary class because there's him and there's Dre Pollard coming in both as cornerbacks this coming weekend. And I look at Dre Pollard as just an explosive guy who can just be really sticky in just stretch the field, that man coverage sort of role where, you see somebody who's got that 4.3 speed on the other side. You can just match him up with somebody like Dre Pollard, which is such an important part of this defense. But I look at Derrick Johnson and just the fit that he would have in this defense is somebody who not only thrives in that press man coverage, but somebody who can just break on balls really, really quickly, play that just kind of deep zone in a cover 3 sort of role, and still just be a ball hawk kind of player. I love what he brings to this unit. And I think he's somebody who is certainly a priority right now. I think he might be number 2 on the list behind somebody like Jaron Jones. But I just look at where he sits, and that was the whole reason we wanted to have this conversation, because you can find a way to take both those guys.
Exactly. And I think it also would be, in a way, a return to kind of that old-fashioned, what UW used to be with the DBU death row mentality of not only a former, Suns player, but just that long, lengthy guy that you can just, pair opposite Elijah Durr and say, okay, we now got, again, you're graduating 2 6'4" guys, Derrick Johnson 6'2", Elijah Durr 6'1", 6'2". Obviously, nobody's going to be Takari on Ephesians, but man, if you can get anywhere close to that, you're already way ahead of the game. And we know John Richardson can develop defensive backs like anybody, especially a cornerback. So I think if there's anybody where, if you happen to take, you mentioned, where if you don't get Devon Benjamin or Jaron Jones, and it's your 3rd guy or your 4th guy on the board, you're not worried about, is there a talent, gap between the other ones? Well, there might be a talent gap, but there's no coaching gap. And so when you have John Richardson to pair with, that's a huge kind of offset in this equation, because then you also throw in with Taylor Mays, what he's able to do with, CJ and the other safety commits or nickel commits that they end up taking. And you look at it and think, no matter who ends up filling it out, because there's a few other targets that we'll talk about, the pairing with the coaching and that versatility, I think, is what's going to kind of, no matter who ends up filling out the class, still check all the boxes that they need at the end of the day.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's such a big part of this when, we look at some of those other guys that not only check the boxes, but just seem to be a high priority target. One of those ones who's coming in this weekend is Gavin Day, 4-star safety, who has just really exploded in the rankings and interest from just schools all over the country, including Washington. And it feels like they've very quickly put themselves at or near the top of his list with just this late push that we've seen in the last 2.5-3 weeks. And it's really interesting. And it's why we wanted to start with Salesi Moa and end up coming back around to Gavin Day is because there's certainly a very realistic world where you can take both those guys and figure out what that's going to look like with CJ Lavender later, where maybe once CJ gets on campus, this is a guy who can play a little bit of nickel alongside Kasani Giles, and you figure out, just that kind of positioning as you go along, which is just kind of brings me back to what I was saying earlier, where you don't turn down the talent. If you can find a way to get all these guys on campus and they all want to commit, great. You figure that out as you move forward. And I think that just this secondary class is turning into the epitome of that, where, the defensive line, the top targets have certainly revealed themselves, and now it's just a matter of closing on those guys. But in the secondary, it feels like you have a lot of options right now. And where you and I are really interested is, where is the coaching staff going to just truly prioritize and just put all its resources into? Is it going to be, going after Jaron Jones and then you figure everything out from there? Or is it, no, we're going to close on Derrick Johnson and Dre Pollard on that May 30th weekend and then continue to just kind of build moving forward?
I think the answer is obviously going to end up being yes, but I think the other thing to consider, right? The other thing to consider with this is when you say close, there's close preseason and then there's close towards the end of the regular season / right before signing day, where we've seen, every year you're always going to have guys that you circle back to one or two more times, or, maybe say Gavin Day commits somewhere and that school ends up, having a lackluster season and you start to reassess things. You can never really predict what's coming down the line. So I think there's enough kind of way to position yourself to where you end up taking, let's say, a Dre Pollard, and you say you take both Nevada guys, you get Dre and Gavin, or sure. Day and Pollard. You're good with that if you don't get Moa, because again, you're in the position of you're going to get talent, and how you make that combination work is up to the coaching staff. But I think, like you mentioned with Kasani Giles, where that's another guy who's got position versatility, and I think it just seems like there's no wrong way to go about this, because there's too much talent on the board you're not going to miss on everybody. There's no doubt about that. I don't think either of us feel that way at all. But whoever ends up being one of those guys or two of those guys, no matter what the combination is, I think we're both satisfied with it, no matter the result. That's
the biggest thing. Is one of the things that you and I just like about this coaching staff so much is the talent evaluation has been there, where it's, we'll go in and watch the film. And it's, I understand why you want to take this guy. I understand why you want to take that guy. And that's one of the most interesting things about it. And, it's something you and I kind of go through a lot, where it's, okay, John Richardson, and, we've yet to see Taylor May since this is his first year as position coach, but John Richardson especially is one of those guys that you and I put at the very top of the list of, trust factor in closing a certain recruit is, can you go out and win that battle over whoever else? And, if it's Gavin Day, it's okay. Are you going to be able to go out and win that battle over Utah, over Iowa? And you and I, if we look at John Richardson, we say, yes, 100%. We feel confident in what he's able to bring to the table. And that's one of the big things about the staff that I think you and I have been really, really impressed with since Jedd Fisch got here, is they take big swings. And after a couple of misses in year one, it feels like they're not doing that so far this year, where a lot of that comes back to, you got Cody Green in the boat as early as you did. You're able to win that battle and get that flip. And then it's the same thing with Derrick Coleman-Brusa, where it's, you win that battle in late April, according to when he said he committed to Jedd Fisch, which is crucial, because now all of a sudden, when you're coming into these other battles that are coming on official visits and they're not yet committed, that's a selling point. That's something you can use and say, hey, look, all these other guys are in the boat, and John Richardson or whoever else can use that as they try to close on some of these prospects.
Yeah, actually, the ironic part is both Derricks were involved in Derrick Bruce's commitment. Leave that for a teaser there for later in the week when we get to both those guys and they're coming in for the visit this weekend. But that's kind of what we're talking about, where you're right there. Everything kind of works together, and no matter how it sorts out, you're more than happy.
Absolutely. That's one thing that we're going to keep an eye on throughout the week, because there's so many visitors that are going to be on campus on Wednesday now as well as Friday. And Lars, maybe there can be a couple more too. So I feel like this conversation needs to start with the one guy who has set an official visit. And that's 3-star tight end Sam Vyhlidal, he's not going to be coming up this Friday. He'll be coming up next Friday as part of the June 6th visit weekend. And it's an interesting conversation where you and I feel somewhat strongly about Washington considering taking 2 tight ends in this class, since you have 4 now coming up on official visits. And this is one of those things where we can talk about him for a minute, but as we kind of look ahead to this Friday, there are 5 players who are committed elsewhere. 3 of them have done so since setting an official visit to Washington. So there might be some changes, not only to this weekend schedule, but moving forward as well.
Yeah, Sam's an interesting one where another Oregon target, so you kind of trust Jordan, like we just finished last night, where you talk about the evaluation. Jordan Papa, very well versed in the state of Oregon. So I think that, that's one where, okay, if he's your second tight end, who's the first? Because that's where this intrigues me, where if he ends up being, deciding to commit to Washington when he comes in for his visit or even before, that's an okay. You like that take, but then who do you pair with? And that's where that kind of gets intriguing to me. Where had you talked about the Landon and Kai Wesley situation where you feel like maybe you thought you could get both, maybe now you only get one of those two, and if you pair them with Sam, you still like that pairing. But it's just I'm curious to see how that situation ends up sorting out. But yeah, with those other guys, I think we pretty much would be surprised if any of the guys that are committed elsewhere check visit, since Anthony Jones literally just committed to UCLA about a week or so ago. You look at a few of those others, and I think that there's always natural, not cancellation, shall we say. And it's not that the staff, made a misread on the situation. I think, things happen to recruitments. Guys decide to commit elsewhere. And sometimes UW is the benefit of that. Sometimes UW is not. And I think you're still looking at the overall list of guys and guys that could potentially be added to the list. And you're still more than healthy going into the weekend.
Yeah, I agree with you there, where one thing with Vyhlidal, before I move on there, is of the 4 tight ends you've got 2 guys that play each kind of role. You got 2 move tight ends in Vyhlidal and Landon Myrie, and then you've got 2 big hulking blocking tight ends in Kai Wesley and Kekuoa Moa. And I look at Kai Wesley as I think he's been the number 1 target for a very, very long time. And that was something I remember writing about that on Huskies Wire at some point, like late December after the 2025 class signed, because it just felt like there was so much interest there. And that's one of the things that really intrigues me about this Vyhlidal prioritization just this late in the cycle, where it feels a lot like, what happened with Vander Ploeg when he ends up flipping to Oregon last year. And then all of a sudden Austin Simmons is committed within like 72 hours, where it's not, obviously things haven't moved quite that fast, but that just seems to be the track that this is on, in my opinion, because he is a really fun athlete when you watch his film, and he would just fit that same kind of role that Decker DeGraff played last year, where, again, it's just a move tight end where you can line him up as an H-back in a whole bunch of different positions around the formation because he has that kind of athleticism. So I'm curious to see how that one works out, and it still feels like Kai Wesley is just that number 1 target because of that size and just the ceiling that he brings to the table. But I look at that and I say, that's something I'm going to be watching going forward. For this weekend, there are a couple names that I'm watching, and we brought up one already on the show, and that's 4-star wide receiver Daniel Odom, where if he wants to come up on a visit with his running mate and Matt Williams, that wouldn't surprise me very much. But the other one who I'm really intrigued by is somebody that was name dropped by our good buddy CJ Lavender when he came on here and after his commitment talked to us about who he might be recruiting to join him. And he said one guy was 3-star defensive back Joshua Holland, who's been committed to USC. That's one of those names where I kind of look at him and I say, are these guys that Washington might be prioritizing? And, the reason we want to talk about Josh Holland now is because there hasn't been a visit set up, but with what CJ told us, there could be some mutual interest there. And that's something that I want to keep an eye on over the course of the week.
Yeah, I would file that one under natural recruiting attrition, where you look at USC, the run that they're on, you always end up losing some guys. And I swear, more often than not, you tell me if I'm wrong, some guys end up falling off, end up popping up better at their next school, like for whatever reason. And
sure.
It's not just a specific USC thing, but you look at some guys and, maybe for whatever reason, the way the game works, that you're taking the higher rated guy, the lower rated guy that decommits ends up actually, having a successful career as well. And I think, he kind of fits that mold where Cali guy, we did talk about that Cali wave about a month or 2 ago now with Kasani Giles mentioning that, even though he's at IMG, originally from California. So a guy that, the staff obviously wants to make inroads in California to keep that traditional pipeline there. And that's kind of the mold that he fits, where you like to take if he ends up coming. If you don't, you still have plenty of guys on the board you can roll with. And I think that'll be the intriguing. Like, if he ends up, I feel like if he ends up coming up, that's a telltale sign of either he's committed to Washington or he's certainly reopening his commitment.
Yeah, so that's just something we want to keep an eye on throughout the week, because doesn't sound like anything is close to being finalized there. So we'll just keep an eye on that process and see what it looks like moving forward. But I look at where this class, not just this class, but this visitor list in particular for this Friday is going to end up just looking like the day before, let's just call it. Because you mentioned Anthony Jones. Ryan Gilbert is another name who's listed on the 247 site right now as set to make an official visit, but he's committed to SMU. That's another one where I don't think that visit's going to happen. And then the Jandro twins is another one where, with Nico being committed to Oklahoma, if Bo ends up following suit there, I feel like that just kind of seems like the most natural thing that's going to end up happening in that recruitment, which just kind of opens up a few more spots for this coaching staff. If you feel that you can handle 15, 16, 17 visitors, all of a sudden some of those spots are open now for you to try to, go out and say, whoever that target might be, hey, we've got room for you this weekend if you're interested, if you want to come up. And I'm curious to see what this is going to look like, because I think there's maybe a name or two that even we're not mentioning right now that just could be worth keeping an eye on.
I agree. I certainly agree with that sentiment. That is well within the cards of this staff to have a surprise guy or two that are, maybe it isn't a surprise when we actually find out who it is, but until then it's like, oh, wait, we didn't really expect that one. And there's some guys where it's, hey, maybe you read some tea leaves and some other things. But the thing that intrigues me is I'm not sure that they would bringing in Salesi Moa on a Wednesday tells me that might be how they sprinkle it, where you're looking at these the June calendar, shall we say. You have the 6th. Which one is the one that has graduation? Because there's a weekend.
It's the 13th, which is the weekend that call is coming in.
Exactly. And so there's ways around it, but I look at that June 20th weekend. If there's anybody that they're going to add, between now and then, I would lean more towards that weekend. You only have 11 guys coming in that weekend. Obviously, Cody Green, technically, I think listed as the day later on the 21st or whatever it is, but that's just a technicality. That would be the weekend where if you see a guy who's currently either committed elsewhere or is a late ad, that's the one where, okay, if he ends up being a commit, call it 2 weeks after or less from that June 20th weekend, you wouldn't be surprised, because that's the last weekend guys can come in for business before the July dead period. That tends to be that weekend where if you're going to flip, that's the weekend to do it. And by the way, the guys coming in on that list, both committed and uncommitted, very good.
Yeah, it's a super solid list. I like where you're going with that, because this is something you and I talked about a few weeks ago, where that first big weekend of visits last year was used to take a whole bunch of big swings, and a bunch of them you swung and missed. And it feels like you're trying to do that this year, with guys like Van Spafford and Madden Williams and whoever else might be coming up that, might be committed elsewhere at this point in time. And I'm curious to see if you might want to add a few more guys to that and just say, hey, look at all these high-end players that are interested in coming to campus, which is a big part of it. But I like where you're going, because that was one of those things where we look at that final weekend of visitors last year, where obviously Zidrus Randy was the headliner from that group. I believe Ryan Dillard-Allen was on that visit list as well. It's one of those things where that one, you just had such a high rate of closing on targets that you get the final visit for. So that's where I'm really interested to see where this goes, because you're right, where if you might, sprinkle in a midweek visitor here or there, if it fits a schedule better, like Salesi Moa, that's great. And it gives you time to just truly say, hey, this is how we feel about you. This is how much of a priority you are. We're hosting you on your own visit, sort of thing. And, if you're right, if there's more that will sign up for that June 20th visit weekend between now and then, that would be a really, really good sign. And I'm just curious to see how this class is going to turn out, because Washington has put themselves in a really great spot with a lot of high-end targets at a lot of different positions. And now the only thing that's left really is to close on those guys.
Yeah, I mean, like that last weekend where you're looking at it and thinking you got 2 tight end targets, you got obviously the big one in Kari Wilder, you got a number of guys on the list, obviously Sari and probably not coming in, but Wasi potentially coming back. And so it's almost like you're seeing a couple of trades happening there. We can't trade college football players just yet. But you look at it and think, again, there's a few guys that intrigue me. You look at Dakota Dixon's also on that last weekend visit list as well. The trenches. Do you sneak in another D lineman somewhere that we're not even talking about, or is committed elsewhere, or maybe was previously at another school, that sort of thing. Those are, because you look at the positions and they feel like it feels like the staff is they know who their targets are, whether you swing and miss or whether you get them. There is a solid 1 to 2 blocks of guys that they know they want to get, or at least have high priority targets for. I think once you get through the summer and kind of circle back into the fall, that's where it might be do you just kind of wait till the season, or wait till see if anybody emerges between call it September and early November. And then you start to say, hey, wow, this guy, we've been keeping our eye on him, didn't bring him up for a visit because we wanted to wait, see how he turned out, ends up popping his senior year. That doesn't always happen, but that also could be another consideration as well.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all every day for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the offseason. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So make sure to click that subscribe button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Tuesday.